The market square lay hushed under a September sun that had lost none of its cruelty, and 300 people stood packed between the shuttered stalls with their empty baskets held against their chests, like beggars at a church door, waiting for one small woman to speak. She stood on the loading dock of the old cannery, with a ledger open in her hands and a line of copper kettles steaming behind her. And beside her, sweating in a linen suit gone gray at the collar, stood the man who owned every grocery contract in the county and had come to buy her out or ruin her. The crowd did not know yet which way she would turn. They knew only that the fruit had failed everywhere but on her hillside, that the shelves in every town for 40 miles stood bare of anything sweet, and that this woman they had laughed at for 2 years now held the last full pantry in the valley. She had not yet said a word. But the truth is, the verdict on Marta Feld had been handed down long before that morning, and it had not been handed down by any of them. It had been handed down by a hillside of split and forgotten fruit, and by the patient work of hands that no one had bothered to watch. Turn the calendar back 2 summers to the day she stepped off the county bus at the crossroads with a single canvas bag and $41 folded into the lining of her coat. She was 34 years old, a widow with no children and no people left in the world she cared to name, and she had come to the valley because the land was cheap and because a woman with nothing left to lose can go wherever she pleases. What she bought, with nearly all she had, was 11 acres on the north shoulder of Gantry Hill, a stony slope that faced the wrong way and caught the frost early and held the sun late. And on it stood a collapsing farmhouse, and a stand of 40-odd plum trees, so old and neglected that the branches touched the ground and the fruit came out small and hard and clustered thick as a rash. The man who sold it to her, an auctioneer named Del Rooker, could barely keep the pity off his face when he counted her money. "Nobody wants that ground," he told her, not unkindly. "The trees are half wild. You'll get nothing off them but hail-split culls and wormy drops, and the market won't touch those. But it's yours now, missus, and I wish you well." She thanked him and asked him only one thing, whether the well still ran, and he said it did, and that was the last kindness anyone in the valley offered her for a long while. Juorda travels in a small place faster than a body can walk, and by the time Marta had swept a mouse nest from the farmhouse and hung her one good dress on a nail, the whole valley knew that a woman alone had bought Gantry's Folly. That was what they called it, Gantry's Folly, after the last man who'd tried and failed to make anything of that slope. When she went into town for flour and nails, she felt the looks travel across the mercantile like a draft under a door. A woman alone, they said it the way you'd say a thing that was half a pity and half a joke. A thing that could not last the winter and did not need to be taken seriously in the meantime. At the seed counter, a cluster of orchardmen stood measuring her with their eyes, and one of them, a big florid man named Court Hessler, who ran the largest plum operation in the county and never let anyone forget it, tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy and said loud enough for the room, "Careful on that hill, missus. Those old trees'll break your back before they fill your basket. My father grubbed out a stand just like it and sowed the ground to pasture, which was the only sensible thing that ever grew there." The men laughed, and Marta paid for her flour and carried it out to the bus without answering, because she had learned in a hard school that being right is its own kind of reply, and it keeps. But the deeper cut came a week later, and it came dressed better. A car she'd never seen pulled up the rutted track to her farmhouse, and out stepped a smooth, unhurried man in a linen suit, hat in hand, smile arranged like a shopkeeper's window. His name was Alvin Prentice, and he was the buying agent for Cornerstone Provision, the grocery consortium that supplied every store and hotel and railway kitchen from the valley clear to the state line. He admired her view. He admired her spirit. He said the word spirit as though it were a small failing he was generous enough to overlook. Then he came to it. Cornerstone was consolidating its orchard sources, he explained, buying up the small holding so the growers wouldn't have to worry themselves with the market's cruelties, and he was authorized to offer her $400 for the whole 11 acres, trees and house and well, Walk away clean, no shame in it. It's a fair price for hill ground, he said. More than fair, given the state of those trees. A woman on her own out here, another winter coming. His eyes moved over her patched coat while he said it. Marta looked at him a long moment and then said plainly, "No, thank you, Mr. Prentice. The plums aren't for sale." He kept his smile, but something behind it went flat and cold, the way a pond goes when the sun leaves it. And he said, "You'll come around, missus. Fruit like that, it teaches a person humility." Then he drove back down the hill, and she watched the dust of him settle over her stony rows, and she went inside and did the arithmetic. That was the ledger she kept, and it was a cruel one that first autumn. She had $11 left after the flour and the nails and a second-hand pruning saw. She had a house that let the wind through in a dozen places, a well, and 43 plum trees that everyone she'd met agreed were worthless. The fruit that year came in exactly as Rooker had promised, small and hard, and a late hailstorm split half of what the branches held so that the ground under the trees was carpeted with cracked and bruised plums that the birds and wasps were welcome to. She gathered a crate of the hail-split fruit anyway, unwilling to see anything wasted, and hauled it down to the Saturday market on a borrowed handcart and set it out beside the polished tables of the real growers. Nobody bought it. A grower's wife glanced at the cracked skins and said loud, "Who'd want split fruit?" and moved on. At the end of the day, Court Hessler, packing up his own bright, unblemished plums, took pity in the way that stings worse than scorn, and pressed $4 into her hand for the whole crate, saying he'd feed them to his hogs, and told her she'd do better to plant something a person could sell. Marta took the $4 because $4 was $4, and she wheeled her empty cart home in the dark. And that night, sitting at the bare table with the split fruit she'd carried back rather than let the hogs have it, she came as close to giving up as she ever would. She had begun to weep quietly, the tired, dry weeping of a person who has run out of plans, when she noticed the smell. She had left the cracked plums in a bowl by the window 3 days gone, and where the split skins had wept their juice, the fruit had not rotted as she'd feared. It had done something else. It had cooked itself down in its own sugar and the warmth of the window into a thick, dark sweetness, and the smell of it filled the little room. Deep and winey and wild, richer by far than any of the perfect plums on Hessler's polished table would ever be, because those were bred for shipping, and these old wild trees had never been bred for anything but flavor. She tasted it off her finger, and she stopped weeping. There was something here. She did not yet know its shape or its worth, but she knew the taste of a thing that could not be bought at any store. And she knew that the whole valley had spent 2 generations throwing it to the hogs. She scraped every bit of that fruit into a pot, and she stayed up past midnight. And by the time the window went gray, she had 6 jars of the darkest, most fragrant plum preserve she had ever tasted in her life, sealed under wax with the last of her sugar. 6 jars. It was not an answer, but it was, for the first time, a beginning. And a beginning is a thing you can build on where an ending is not. The elder came to her in the last week of that first autumn, when the leaves had gone and the branches stood bare and honest against the sky. Her name was Ottilie Brant, and she was old past anyone's reckoning. A widow who had come over from the old country as a girl and kept a small garden 2 farms down, and was held by the valley in a regard that was half respect and half wariness. For she said little and saw much and had a way of being right that unsettled people. She walked up the track with a basket over her arm and let herself through the gate as though she had every year of a long life's right to, and she stood a long while among the low old trees, running her thumb over the gray bark, before she said anything. "These are the old blood," she said at last, in her soft, deliberate cadence. "The kind they do not plant any more, because they will not travel and they will not hurry. Everyone else has cut them out." She looked at Marta with pale, steady eyes. "The land remembers," what the farmer is always forgetting," she said. "It does not shout it. It whispers once, and then it waits to see who is listening. You must learn to be the one who listens." Then Ottilie set her basket on the ground and reached into it, and drew out an object wrapped in cloth, and unwrapped it, and it was a sugar cone, hard and heavy and white, worth more than Marta had spent on nails. "Take it," the old woman said. "The others prune those trees like they are punishing a child. You must not. Let them grow as they wish to grow, low and close, and let the frost come early to that slope. For the cold is not your enemy on this hill, it is the thing that makes the sugar rise in the fruit. Hassler prunes for the eye of the buyer. You will let these grow for the tongue, and when the fruit comes cracked, do not curse it. The crack is the door the sweetness comes out of." Marta held the sugar cone in both hands and asked, "Why are you helping me?" And the old woman almost smiled. "Because I am old," she said, "and I have watched clever men grub out treasure to plant fodder, and it is a thing that has always grieved me. Now there is someone on this hill who does not think she knows better than the ground. That is rarer than you would believe." Then she took up her empty basket and walked back down the track, and Marta stood among the trees a long time in the failing light, and for the first time she looked at the low crooked branches not as a burden, but as an inheritance. Through the long winter, Marta learned her craft the only way a person learns anything worth knowing, by ruining a great deal of it first. She had 6 jars from the first accident, and she meant to have 600 from intention. She read what she could find, an old cannery pamphlet, a book of household receipts left in the farmhouse by some previous tenant, but mostly she learned by tasting and burning and starting over. She learned that the wild old plums needed less sugar than the receipts called for because their own sweetness ran so deep, and that the cracked skins she'd been taught to despise gave the preserve its color and its backbone, and that if she cooked it slow and low over the wood stove, stirring by hand for hours until her shoulders screamed, the fruit gave up a flavor that a hurried factory kettle could never coax from it. She traded 3 of her precious first jars to Ottilie for a copper kettle the old woman no longer used, and she scavenged jars from the ditch behind the mercantile where the town threw its glass, and she boiled them clean, and she made her arithmetic new. It was no longer the arithmetic of despair. It was the arithmetic of a thing that grew. 1 crate of culls, $4 thrown away, became 40 jars of preserve. And 40 jars, if a person could ever sell them at even a modest price, became more than the fruit had ever fetched whole. The land had whispered, and she had listened, and now she was doing the sum the whole valley had never bothered to work. She was not alone in it for long. There was a boy from the Tobler place, down the road, a poor sharecropping family with too many children and too little of everything, and the boy was named Tobin, and he was 10 years old and did not talk much. He took to appearing at her fence in the cold mornings, watching her carry wood and stir the kettle, saying nothing, until one day she waved him in out of the wind and gave him a heel of bread spread thick with the preserve, and after that he was hers. He never mocked her. Because he had not yet learned from the grown people that she was a thing to be mocked, he only saw a woman making something good out of what everyone else threw down, and to a hungry, watchful boy that was plain sense. He helped her gather the drops in season, and fed the stove, and washed the salvaged jars, and he gave the trees names. The big old, gnarled one at the top of the slope he called the grandfather, because it stood over the others, and the twin trees by the well he called the brothers. And Marta found that she had come to love the sound of the boy's rare voice in the quiet of the hill, more than she would have thought a solitary woman could. He asked her once why the townfolk laughed at her, and she thought about it and said, "Because they can only count what they can see." And he said, "That's a poor way to count." And she said, "Yes, it is." The first stranger came the following summer, at the height of the second season, when the low old trees hung so heavy with fruit that Marta and Tobin propped the branches with poles to keep them from breaking. She had by then a small, steady trade, selling jars off the tailboard of her handcart at the Saturday market. And the valley had gone from laughing at her to ignoring her, which she counted as progress. But this man was not from the valley. He was a chef, a Frenchman by his accent, who ran the dining car service for the railway line and had come up from the city on the branch train to buy blackberries from another farm, and had stopped at her cart out of idle curiosity. He tasted the preserve off the little wooden spoon she kept for the purpose, and he went very still, the way a person does when a memory catches them by the collar. And he tasted it again, and then he looked at her with something like accusation. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. "This is not market fruit. This is the old kind, the kind we cannot get any more, the kind my grandmother made. What variety are these plums?" And Marta told him they were only the wild old trees off Gantry Hill that everyone said were worthless. And the man laughed, a short astonished laugh, and said, "Worthless? Madame, the men who told you that are fools, who have forgotten what fruit is supposed to taste of." He bought every jar on the cart that day at 3 times her asking price, without haggling a penny. And he took her name. And before the branch train pulled out, he had ordered 100 jars for the railway's first-class dining service to be delivered by autumn, at a price that made Marta sit down on an upturned crate when he was gone and stare at the figures until they stopped swimming. 100 jars! It was more than she had made in the whole year, ordered in the space of one conversation by a man who had judged her fruit, not by who grew it or where, but simply by what it was. That was the vindication, and it came, as such things do, in the only language the scornful truly understand, which is the language of money paid gladly by someone whose opinion cannot be dismissed. She told no one. She banked the news the way you bank a coal under the ash at night, laying it low and covering it over so its heat is kept and hidden until you need it. Because she had learned that a woman alone who lets her success be seen too soon will find the whole valley reaching to take a share of it. She and Tobin worked from dark to dark through that autumn, and Audalie came up the hill to sit by the kettle and murmur her corrections, and they filled the Frenchman's order and a standing one after it, and Marta bought a second copper kettle and then a third, and repaired the roof of the farmhouse one winter's night at a time. And still, she wore her patched coat to the Saturday market, and let the valley go on pitying her. And the coal burned low and hot under the ash, and no one saw it. But a thing kept hidden is not a thing kept forever, and Alvin Prentice was a patient man in the service of a hungry company. He noticed, the way a buying agent notices, that the amount of glass being scavenged from the mercantile ditch had gone to nothing, and that the railway's provisioner had crossed the valley off his usual list of plum suppliers, and that the sugar merchant in town was selling far more sugar up the Gantry Road than a single failing woman ought to need. He came up the track a second time, in a newer car, with a wider smile, and this time his offer was not $400. It was $2,000 for the land and the trees, and the name of the preserve, and what he called the goodwill of the enterprise. "Cornerstone will handle the selling," he told her. "The shipping, the accounts, all the parts a lady oughtn't to trouble herself with. You'll have a fair wage and no worries. It's a generous offer, missus, more than generous. And I'll be honest with you, it won't stand forever." Marta stood in the doorway of her mended house with flour on her hands and said plainly, "No, thank you, Mr. Prentice." And this time his smile did not merely go flat. It curdled. He looked at the kettles steaming through the window and the ricks of clean jars, and he said softly, "You're making a mistake, and mistakes on a hill like this have a way of compounding." And then he drove away, and Marta felt the first cold breath of the thing that was coming. It came in 3 waves, each tighter than the last, the way a snare draws. The first was rumor. One began to travel the valley, laid down soft and untraceable as frost, that the preserves of Gantry Hill were made from rotten fruit, spoiled drops, that a body could take sick from them, that a woman working alone with no inspection and no oversight could not be trusted to put up food fit to eat. Marta's few local sales dried up overnight. Mothers who had bought a jar for a sick child now crossed to the other side of the market square. The second wave was harder. Prentice, who sat on the board of the County Fair Association and half the civic bodies besides, saw to it that a new ordinance was raised requiring any commercial cannery to hold a costly license and pass an inspection by an examiner who happened to answer to Cornerstone, and Marta's little kitchen operation was declared, by letter, to be operating outside the law with a date set by which she must cease or be fined into ruin. The third wave was the plainest of all. Prentice came a final time, not smiling now, and stood in her yard and told her that the license could be made to appear, that the rumors could be made to quiet, that all of it could be made to go away, if only she would sign, and that if she would not. What did then? A woman alone, on a lonely hill, ought to think hard about how many things could go wrong out here with no one to see. Marta looked at him and thought of the coal banked under the ash, and she said, "You've been counting my sugar, Mr. Prentice." And he said sharp, before he could stop himself, "You've bought 1,100 pounds of it since June, more than any single kitchen could use. So don't stand there and tell me you're a hobbyist." And in that one precise, greedy number, the exact weight he could only have known by spying on the merchant's books, he told her everything about himself, and told her, too, that he was afraid. Because you do not send a man to count another person's sugar unless you believe there is treasure in the house. Then the drought came, and it came like the open door of a furnace, and it changed the shape of everything. The summer that followed was the driest the valley had known in 50 years. The rains that should have come in May did not come, nor in June nor July. The creek that fed the flat rich orchards along the valley floor ran to strings and then to cracked mud, and the great modern plum operations that had been bred for shipping and for yield, that stood in long straight thirsty rows on ground that drank 10 times what a hill would, began to fail. Court Hessler watched his hundreds of trees drop their fruit, half-formed, and then begin to drop their very leaves, and there was no water to give them, for his wells were sunk in valley ground that the drought had turned to dust. Up and down the county, it was the same. The orchards that everyone had been proud of, the sensible modern plantings that the small holdings had been grubbed out to make room for, stood dying in the heat, and by August it was plain that there would be almost no plum crop in the valley at all, and no fruit of any kind to speak of, and the shelves of every store that Cornerstone supplied began, jar by jar and box by box, to empty. But the wrong-facing stony north shoulder of Gantry Hill did not fail. The old wild trees, with their roots driven deep over 60 patient years into the rock, and their low, close canopy that shaded their own ground, needed a fraction of the water that the pampered valley trees demanded. And Marta's good, well, the one thing everyone had agreed the place still had, ran cool and steady from a spring far under the hill that the drought on the surface could not reach. She and Tobin carried water in the dark of the mornings and mulched the ground thick with straw, and the grandfather at the top of the slope, and the brothers by the well, and all their gnarled kin hung on, and set their fruit and swelled it slowly in the merciless sun. And because the old wisdom held true, and stress and cold and hardship only drive the sugar deeper, the plums that came off Gantry Hill that terrible summer were the finest the trees had ever borne. And in the mended farmhouse the copper kettles steamed from dawn to dark, and the shelves in the cool cellar filled with row upon row upon row of dark sealed jars, and Marta Feld, alone on her worthless hill, sat in the one green productive orchard in a valley of dying trees, holding without ever having schemed for it the only sweet fruit for 40 miles in any direction. The valley came to her then, one by one, as the drought bit down. The first to climb the track was Court Hessler, and it cost him more to make that walk than any man in the valley knew, for he was the one who had laughed loudest at the seed counter, the one who had grubbed out his father's old trees for sensible rows, one who had pressed $4 into her hand for a crate of split fruit, and told her to plant something she could sell. His fine operation was ruined. His trees were dying and his contracts with Cornerstone were being called against him, and he stood to lose the very land his family had held for 3 generations. He came up the hill with his hat literally in his hands, and stood in her yard, where Prentice had stood, and he could barely bring himself to the words. "My family's put up preserves off our own trees for the county fair for 40 years, he said, staring at his boot. "My wife's mother did it, and her mother. This year we've got nothing, not a jar, and the store's got nothing. There's folks in this valley with sick children and old people, and not a spoonful of anything sweet to be had, and no fruit coming, and they're saying you've got a cellar full." He looked up at her at last, and his florid face was gray. "I can't pay you what it's worth," he said. "Nobody can, the way things are. But I'm asking." And there it was laid in her hands, the choice that all of it had been driving toward, the power to answer scorn with scorn, and want with a price, or to answer it with something else. She did not answer him at once. She looked a long moment at this ruined, boastful man who had once fed her fruit to his hogs, and she remembered the $4, and she remembered the laughter at the seed counter, and she felt how sweet it would be to name him a price he could not pay, and watch him walk back down the hill as she had walked, empty-handed in the dark. And then she thought of the boy Tobin, who had said that counting only what you can see is a poor way to count, and she thought of old Audley saying that the land remembers what the farmer forgets, and she understood that the land had been teaching her a longer sum than the one she had been working. "Come back on Saturday," she told Cord Hessler. "Bring the whole valley. Bring anyone that's got a want. And tell Alvin Prentice to come too." And she would say no more than that, and Hessler went back down the hill, not knowing whether he had been granted mercy or promised a reckoning. And by Friday the word had gone through every farm and hollow in the county that the woman on Gantry Hill had called the valley to the old cannery on Saturday morning, and that Cornerstone's man would be there, and that something was going to be settled. Which brings us back to the loading dock and the September sun that had lost none of its cruelty, and the 300 people packed between the shuttered stalls with their empty baskets held against their chests, and the copper kettles steaming behind her, and Alvin Prentice sweating in his gray-collared linen suit, arrived with a fat contract and the confidence of a man who has always in the end been able to buy what he wanted. He spoke first, because men like him always speak first. He told the crowd, in his smooth, carrying voice, that Cornerstone stood ready to purchase the entire output of the Gantry orchard and distribute it fairly through its stores at a reasonable price. That this was the orderly way, the responsible way, that a lone woman could not be expected to handle a resource so vital to the public good in a time of crisis, and that he was prepared out of the goodness of the company to make Mrs. Feld a generous final offer this very morning so that the valley's needs could be met. He turned to her with his window display smile and named a figure, and it was a large figure, and he held out the contract and a pen. Marta Feld looked at the pen, and then she looked out over the 300 faces she knew. The mothers who had crossed the square to avoid her, the men who had laughed at the seed counter, the grower's wife who had asked who would want split fruit, ruined Cord Hessler with his hat in his hands and little Tobin at the front with his family, watching her with that steady, watchful faith. And she did not take the pen. "Mr. Prentice," she said, and her quiet voice carried across the hushed square better than his practiced one had, "you've been trying to buy this hill since the first week I came to it. You offered me $400 when you thought it was worthless, and $2,000 when you found out it wasn't. And now that the whole valley's thirsty for what grows on it, you'd have them buy it back from your shelves at whatever price you cared to set. You've spread rumors about my fruit, and bought a law to shut my kitchen, and you've counted my sugar down to the pound." She let that last land, and she watched the color leave his face as the crowd stirred, understanding it, understanding that the man who claimed to serve the public good had set a spy on a widow's grocery bills. "The plums are not for sale," she said, "to you, or to any company. Not now, and not ever." Then she turned from him to the crowd, and she opened the ledger in her hands. "I've got just over 900 jars in that cellar," she said, "and 43 trees still bearing, which, by my count, is enough to see every family in this valley through until the rains come. You'll not buy them from Cornerstone, and you'll not buy them from me either. Not the fruit itself, because the fruit was a gift from the ground, and no one has the right to sell you a gift. But the making of them cost me sugar and wood, and the labor of my hands and a boy's, and that much a person can fairly ask to be paid for. So here is my price: a quarter of the going rate, in money, or in trade, or in a morning's work up on the hill carrying water, whichever a family can manage." And no family turned away for having none of the three. She closed the ledger. "Come up on Saturdays, and I'll teach any woman who wants to know how it's done. So the next time the valley goes thirsty, it won't have to come begging to one hill. That's my offer. There's no paper to sign. You have my word, and out here I found a person's word keeps better than a contract." For a moment, the square was so still you could hear the kettles hiss. And then Kurt Hessler, who had laughed loudest of all men, took off his hat and held it against his chest, and said in a voice thick with shame, and something more than shame, "God keep you, Maude Feld." And one by one all across the square, the men took off their hats, and the mothers who had crossed the street to avoid her stood with tears cutting clean lines through the dust on their faces, and the whole valley turned toward her, as surely as a field of grain turns toward the light, and turned its back, in the same motion, on the man in the linen suit. Alvin Prentice stood alone with his unsigned contract, and his large, useless figure and his greed laid bare in front of every soul he had meant to profit from, and he saw that there was nothing here for him to buy, and no one left who would sell, and he folded his paper and put away his pen, and walked out to the parting crowd to his car. And no one said a word to him, which was the loudest thing that could have been said. He drove down out of the valley, and he did not come back, defeated, not by any weapon or any court, but by the plain, unanswerable fact of one woman's decency, which is a thing that greed can never find a price of, because it was never for sale. The rains came at the end of that month, soft at first, and then in a great, grateful drumming that went on for 3 days, and filled the creeks, and soaked the cracked valley floor, and drummed on the mended roof of the farmhouse on Gantry Hill, while Marta and Tobin and half the women of the county worked the steaming kettles below. The valley healed slowly, as land does. Kurt Hessler replanted a corner of his ground the following spring, and when he did it he set out, on the stoniest north-facing acre he owned, a stand of the old wild plum trees that his father had grubbed out, cuttings taken with her blessing from the grandfather at the top of her slope. She was no longer Gantry's folly nor the woman alone. That phrase they had used to make her small. She was, from that autumn forward, simply Marta of the Hill, whose word was good and whose door was open, and the preserves that had once been thrown to the hogs now went out under her name to tables far beyond the valley, and there was a waitlist for them by every September, and she filled it slow and low and by hand, and would not be hurried. Old Ottilie Brandt came up the track one last time near the end, when she was very old indeed, and sat by the kettles in the good warm smell of cooking fruit, and watched the young women Marta had taught moving about the work, and Tobin, grown tall now, propping the heavy branches of the grandfather with poles. She reached over and took Marta's calloused hand in her thin one. "You listened," she said, in her soft, deliberate cadence. "That is the whole of it." They all wanted to shout at the ground and make it answer, and you were the one who went quiet and let it speak. She looked out at the low crooked trees hanging heavy in the September light. The old blood that no one else had wanted, that had fed a whole valley through its worst year, and asked nothing but to be let grow as it wished. "The land remembers what the farmer forgets," she said one more time, "and it whispers only once, and waits to see who was listening." And then she smiled, a small, satisfied smile, the smile of one who has lived long enough to see a thing set right this time. She said someone was. Down the slope, a wren was building in the split hollow of the grandfather's oldest branch, in the very crack that everyone had once called ruin. And out of that ruin comes spring, would come new life, as it always had, for anyone patient enough to wait for it and quiet enough to see.
We'll go to... No, I was supposed to make iron bars and I totally forgot. Oops. How do we get Flareon to show up? Pizza. We have to build lots of stuff. Okay. I aspire to be like Nelly some one day. Yeah, we'll take all of this iron. Your house looks good with the windows. Oh, thanks, Manuela. Yeah, I'm really happy with the way our base is coming along. And I put like this little cafe area, so that all the EVs can come and hang out, like the evolutions. Also, Maju, both are right. It just depends on like what you're trying to say for either of them. Who do you think would be taller? Leafeon? Okay. You go to class. It was good to see you. Oh, it was good to see you too, Lynn. Have a good day at school. Okay, let's go to... I feel like we should bring someone here. Okay.